This is our webinar on CSF Next and how you can write stories with less boilerplate and just do so faster, more effectively. It's kind of the next evolution of CSF, and we'd love to show it to you. Before I do that, though, I'm going to introduce myself. So I'm Kyle Gatch. I'm a DX engineer here at Chromatic, working primarily on Storybook. Kasper, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Kasper. I'm a software engineer for Storybook. So I work on the project and I also designed CSF factories together with a couple of other people.
Yeah, a lot of the ideas that we're going to show here, Kasper has driven much of these. So I wanted him to join us for this webinar in particular so that any questions that arise or any conversation that we have the expert here in the room with us. So, all right. So before I show what CSF Next is, I just want to do a really quick overview of Storybook. So here's a Storybook. What it does is it renders your UI components in isolation, meaning like outside of the rest of your application. Or if you have a design system, like it just gives you a place to render those components by themselves, unaffected by the rest of your application. And then it captures like states or combinations of props of those components in what we call a story. So this is our default story of the button component, and you can see it's just rendering a button. Or we could make it disabled. We could make it clear in appearance. We can add an icon,
Kyle,
etc.
are you sharing your screen? I think
I am not sharing my screen. Thank you so much. Sorry about that. Let me start over. So this now is Storybook, which hopefully you can see.
Yes.
As I said, it renders components in isolation. So here we've got our button component, and we capture what we call stories. So a story is like the component with various props or sometimes various state applied. So in this case, this is just the default button with the only prop is, in this case, is children. This is button. You can apply the disabled prop, and that gives us the disabled story. You can add an icon, like so. And then Storybook has add-ons. So here we're seeing the control add-on where you can update. There we go. You can update the props, like we can make it round. And then you can even, if you want to, I could either change this default story to have these new props or create a brand new story from the props that I've done. So, and then you can auto-generate documentation from those stories. So here, I guess that is not actually Autodocs, but this is showing MDX, so custom written documentation. So especially for like a design system, this could be really useful where you show like how you use it. In this case, we've embedded some design specs in here. So that's, oh, and then as of Storybook 9, you can also test your components. So we have what we call the test widget down here. This uses vtest to automatically test every single one of your stories. And so I'm going to just test button, actually. So I can do this for only button if I wanted to. Of course. This is a new sample repo, and I have not installed Playwright. That's okay. We don't need to do that. There's another multiple webinars on testing if you want to cover that. But what we're really here for is discussing CSF. And so CSF is how we capture these stories. So it's what tells us, it's what tells Storybook to render this button with these props or in this state, etc. And so I kind of wanted to go over like a history of CSF so you can see how we arrived at CSF Next. So that's what I'm going to do now. So we've got, first we have CSF 1. So this came in 2019. And it was our first attempt at being able to render components like declaratively in isolation. And so you import the button, so the component that we care about. We have a little bit of metadata here, which we just call meta, but it's the export default in the file. You apply a title, you tell it which component we care about, and then each of the stories are just a named export, and then it's just in this case it's a React component, but it supports more than just React. But it's a function that ultimately returns what you want to render, and that's really all it was. And so there wasn't a lot of reuse. You had to duplicate yourself a lot. And so just a year later, we came up with CSF2, which is backwards compatible. And so it abstracts that button rendering into something we call the template. And so you make the template here. It's a function that accepts something called args now, and then you just apply those args to the component. And what that allows you to do is now your named exports, your stories, they're just copies of that template. And then you can define args independent of the template. So that means you're not copying this template across, you're just changing the args as necessary. And what this allowed is something we call cascading or inheritance. And so now you can define the args not just on the individual story, but you could actually define it up here in the metadata that applies to every story. So each one of these stories is going to have the children arg applied to it. And then the default only has that arg. The icon adds additional args, and disabled adds an additional arg. So that's CSF2, but there's still a lot of boilerplate here, like this template.bind stuff. And
Can I say one
you,
thing, Kyle?
yes, please, Kasper.
Yeah, so maybe it's also important to know, like we also introduced it so that those arcs can be controllable in the controls panel, so that you also can
That's
change
true.
all those on the fly.
Yeah, the controls panel that I showed to start, this was enabled in
Yeah,
CSF2.
yeah.
Um, so in CSF3, we took it one step further. So now the story, the default case where we don't apply any args except for the children from the meta, you can see that's just an empty object now. So you might be wondering, like, well, how does it know to render the button? Well, we realized that a majority of stories that people were writing just take all the args and then apply all the args to the button. And that's all they do. And so we made that an implicit default of the format. You can change that, of course. There's a render property where you can apply whatever you want. But by default, that same CSF2 function here, args spread onto a button, that's now applied by default in CSF3. Also, the title is no longer necessary. We can just infer from where your component or where your stories file is in the file system, where it should be in your storybook sidebar. Um, so yeah, so the default case just becomes an empty object, and then the rest of these stories are now just objects with properties. Um, this is pretty great. And we also, you might notice I switched from JavaScript to TypeScript here. And that's because we significantly improved our TypeScript with CSF3, which Kasper was also a huge part of. Um, and so we've got satisfies like meta type of button so that we get type safety on our meta. And then we create this story type here based on the meta. And then we apply that story or assign it to each of our stories to get full type safety there. But still, this is quite a bit of boilerplate. And so finally, I would like to show you where we're headed with CSF Next. So within CSF Next, there's something we call CSF factories. And so now the meta is created by doing preview.meta. I'll show you what preview is in a second. So that creates your meta. Notice there's no type assignment whatsoever, but you still have full type safety. And then from the meta, that now has a story method. So meta.story is how you create the stories. And then it's the same object from CSF3. That part is exactly the same. Um, so yeah, there's no more type assignment, and yet you have even better type safety than you had in CSF4 or CSF3. Apologies. To show you the rest, I need to actually jump into the editor. So that's what I'm going to do now. Kasper, while I'm doing that, did I miss anything?
No, I think it's perfect.
All right. So I told you I'd show you what preview was. So I ran a code mod, which I'm going to show you how to do, to convert one of my stories files to CSF factories. And what that does is it also converts my preview. I probably need to zoom in a little bit here. So it also converts my preview and my main configuration. So for preview, all it really does is it wraps what was an object in this define preview function, and then it still gets exported by default. So here we used to have const preview. Now we have define preview. That's really all it does. And then the other important thing, this diff is really hard to read. I apologize for that. Let me just open the file. There we go. Okay, so export default, define preview function, and then that object is the same as it would have been in the preview, except for add-ons. So you may remember in the main.ts, you've got an array of add-ons that you register, and that's how you tell Storybook, please use these add-ons. Well, with CSF factories, let's see if I can get back to it. CSF factories adds an add-on property to the preview object as well. And the reason why we do that is this is what enables type safety and autocomplete for the parameters in your stories and in your meta as well, which is something that people have been asking us for years. And Kasper finally figured out this solution to that pretty hairy problem. And so by registering your add-ons both in main, which tells Storybook to use it, and in preview, which provides all the type safety, we finally have parameter type safety. Now, I will say this depends on the add-on. So like community add-ons will need to update to export their types in a certain way that we can pick up. But we did that based on conventions and standards. So we're hoping that it will not be a big lift. Kasper, do you have anything else to add on that particular part? I was going to demo how that works.
No, I think that's perfect. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks. So that's preview where you have this defined preview. For main, it's very similar. You just have defined main.
Maybe one thing to add is like you might think like it's maybe hard to get those things in sync or whatever. Like we have an error if they're not in sync because we want you to keep them in sync. And also if you use a Storybook add command, then we will add them to your preview and your main directly.
That's right. And also the code mod, again, I'll show you in a little bit. The code mod will handle that for you as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, we try to do the work for you wherever possible. So now in the stories file, I told you, where did that preview come from? Well, that is the default export from our preview configuration file. You just import that directly in your story. And then because that has all of your parameters, your args, like everything applied to the whole project is in that preview. Because we're just a method off of that, TypeScript can know what all of those values were, including the add-ons array, like I showed you. And so that's why we call it CSF factories, is because it's a series of factory functions, which is a pattern in JavaScript. So this meta function method is a factory off of the preview, and the story function method is a factory off of the meta that you create. And that chained effect means you have full type safety across every level of it without applying any types whatsoever. It's really great, honestly. Kasper did incredible work to make this happen. But that's not all that CSF Factories does. Because it's functions instead of just objects, we can be a little more helpful with like reusing stories or parts of stories. And so we also have this extend where you can take a story, like here I've got my with label story. Instead of just extend or doing meta.story, you can do with label.extend. And then that will like kind of intelligently merge this story definition with the story definition that was already there with label. So in this case, I'm adding a placeholder arg on top of my ID and label args. So yeah, just trying to be as helpful as possible to really quickly write some stories. The other thing I wanted to show is that type completion. So we've got parameters and then layout, and then just showing some autocomplete here. So we could do layout centered, full screen, none, or padded. So if I do layout centered. So yeah, autocomplete for parameters. First time ever. All right.
Actually, also globals are inferred from your add-on, so it's
Oh
not
yeah,
only
cool.
parameters.
Okay. So globals meaning the what affects like the background or
Viewports.
viewports. Yeah. So like if you want to force a viewport, that's a terrible choice. Let's go to extra small. Interesting.
Maybe
There we
iPhone.
go. Okay. So if you want to force a viewport or force a background um, on a story, you could do that with globals.
Yeah.
Well, I guess you can't dismiss that if it's. Let me try to refresh to get that away. Awesome. I'm not going to waste your time by installing Playwright. That can take a little bit of time. Okay, let me reset that. Okay, so those are CSF factories. But CSF Next includes more than just CSF factories. So before I explain that, I wanted to show we have recently documented what we call the features life cycle for Storybook. And so everything in Storybook going forward, like features that we add or features that we change, are going to go through this life cycle where it starts in experimental, it goes to preview, and then finally stable, and then eventually, if necessary, deprecated. So CSF Factories today is in preview state. That basically means it is all but ready to use in production. In fact, you probably could use it in production if you wanted to, but it may not have like full support across Storybooks like usages. So for example, CSF Factories is available right now today in Storybook 9 even, but only if you're using React. It's limited to React right now while we hammer out the details. So that's why it's in preview. But we do not anticipate that API to change at all. It's gone through a lot of rounds of feedback. It's pretty stable in that regard. It's just not available for all of what Storybook can do. So that's why it's preview. The stage before that, experimental, that's where the API might still change. We're actively seeking feedback, that sort of thing. We have a feature that I'm going to show you in experimental. But obviously, after preview comes stable. That's what you'd expect. It's stable. It's ready to use in production, etc. And then deprecated is just how we remove something. So CSF Factories, to be clear, is in preview. It's usable in React. Let me just show you the docs for those real quick. So if you go to the CSF API reference, there's now a tab here. If you click on that, this covers what all is in CSF Next, which right now it's just CSF Factories. So it covers the define main, the define preview, preview.meta, meta.story, and story.extend. And then it also has instructions on how to upgrade. So just make sure you're on the latest version of Storybook. And then there is this auto migration script that we've written here, which will give you a couple prompts, but otherwise guides you through applying the upgrade yourself. Otherwise, we go into detail about what exactly it takes to upgrade manually, just in case that script doesn't work or you just want to kind of know what it's going to do beforehand. Let me go ahead and put this link in the chat for y'all. Okay. So CSF Factories is available in preview for React, but go to version 10 docs. Version 10 of Storybook is in beta and should be launching in the next couple weeks, I'd say. There is this story.test that is in experimental. And so we, actually, one very important thing I didn't talk about with CSF3. CSF3 added the play function, which allows for kind of simulating behavior. So you can, in this case, we've got a login form component. And so we can find the input with the email ID, and we can type in an email. We can find the one with a password. We can type in a password. We can click the submit button, and then we can even make assertions where we like expect this success text to be in the DOM. And we can do all that within Storybook. And Storybook 9 added the component testing capabilities, which I apologize is not working in my local demo, but where you can actually run these in an automated test directly inside of your Storybook UI. It's really cool. Anyway, so Storybook 3 or CSF3 added this play function, which really opened up a whole new usage and use cases for stories, which is largely testing. They were no longer just like static tests that either served as a render test or maybe a visual test. But now you could do interactive testing as well. Like you could test the functionality of things. But the story format, like all this syntax, we got feedback that that really wasn't the greatest for writing tests like that. Like tests often have long names that are more like sentence case to really describe the exact case that you need to test. And this just doesn't really look like other testing tools you may be familiar with, like vtest or Jest. And so we have this dot test method. So just like you could extend off of a story, you can do a dot test method off of a story. And then it accepts two or three, I'll show you, but primarily two arguments, where the first is the name of the test. So that can just be sentence case. It can be super long if you want. I'll show you some other examples in a second. And then second is that same play function that we had before. It's exactly the same. And so you do everything that you did before in the play function, but now it doesn't require all the cruft of a story. It can be attached to a simpler story. So let me show you a real world example. This is just like a simplified one for the docs. So let's go back to my editor. Okay, so I've got an error validation story for an input component here. I've defined the story right here. So I apply some args, and then I actually define a custom render. And that's because I want it to have some internal state. And so I'm just using value, set value to just have some internal state. And that's so I can type into it and then check that when I unfocus it, that some validation is applied. And so I've got a test here where I've got an invalid email with no @ sign. Here I've got one with an invalid email with no domain. I've got a few more, but I'll show you those in a second. Now, if I was to write a story for these, it would just be a really repetitive. And the visual result of all of them is going to be the same. It's just the same, please enter a valid email address, like error state. And so having stories for each one isn't that valuable. In fact, it's arguably noisy in your sidebar to have that many stories showing the exact same thing. And so that's why when you do a test, it displays differently in the sidebar. So I'm going to show you that now. So the input is under this form category. So here's my error validation story, and you'll notice it has a caret to be expanded. And so when I click on that, the tests are nested underneath that story. And so you can just collapse them down and not have to worry about it at all. And additionally, if you really never want to see the stories, we have beefed up the filter menu here for the sidebar. So I can take and I can show only tests, or I can exclude all of those tests. And so now those tests are just gone entirely. They just do not appear. And we have some configuration available where you could, for instance, when you build your storybook, you can just automatically exclude those tests from the sidebar. Um, and if you need to get back to them, just uncheck that box and there they are. Or like I said, you could click this and only show tests. And so now you can see it filtered down to only the tree that has tests. So I'm gonna keep it like that. That's nice and simple. So here's my test. It otherwise, with the exception of the sidebar, it otherwise behaves exactly like a story. You still have all your add-ons, especially the interactions one, which is important here. So this is showing each of the steps in that play function to do the test. I can debug it just like I could any other test. And then, so now all these things that have almost exactly the same visual output, like these don't serve a purpose for documentation. These definitely don't serve a purpose for visual tests, but they do serve a purpose to make sure that the complicated regex that I'm using to validate emails covers all the cases that are necessary. And so, yeah, you can have as many tests as you want and not clutter up your sidebar, not take too many visual snapshots, etc. I see that overrides question. I was going to show that. So I just want to show you kind of a trick of the API. So you might notice there's even a lot of repetition between these tests where the only thing that changes is the string that I'm typing in. And so I just abstracted that into a function right here, check validation. And now my dot test just calls this check validation function. It passes in the context, which is what the argument received by the play function, or sorry, test function. So it passes in context and then it passes in the string that I want to type. And so now I've got just great deduplication just using standard JavaScript, like kind of abstraction. And then so that's going to be, I think, a common pattern where if you're testing varieties of the same thing over and over again, you're going to want to abstract it into a function like that. And then finally, I did want to show, so I mentioned that the test method can have 2 or sometimes 3 arguments. So the first argument is always the name of the test. Again, that's just any string. It can be sentence, like sentence case. And then the last argument is always the test function. But there's an optional middle argument of just a typical standard like story context. So in this case, I want to apply a different arg for the value, and then start from there when I type in the rest. And I'll show you what that story does. So that is validating that if I start invalid, so I start here, and then I complete it with a validity, then the error message goes away. So that is the .test method, which again is experimental. That means it's available for use, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. So it's available for use, but the API not at all set in stone. We're actively seeking feedback on it, and we're just trying to come up with the best possible solution for all the details around it. So because it's experimental, it's actually not fully documented in the Storybook documents. It is instead documented in this RFC, which stands for request for comment. And so this is how we kind of explain what it is. We show how it works in the sidebar. We tell you how to get started. And then we show you how to use it. And then most importantly, we attempt to tell you when to write a story versus when to write a test, when to use a play function versus when to use a test, which is kind of the written version of the demo that I just showed you. And then finally, there's some advanced techniques such as overriding annotations. So that's that middle argument that I showed you here. Reusing test logic, which I showed you. And then there's that configuration for how to, by default, exclude all tests from the sidebar. So you can imagine if you're publishing a design system using Storybook, probably doesn't make sense to publish all of those tests when you build the Storybook. So when you can use, like, for example, an environment variable When you set publish to true, it will by default exclude all of those tests from your sidebar so that the consumers of your design system don't even need to know they're there. They're still tested in CI, they're still visually tested if you want, whatever. But when you actually publish it for like documentation use, they don't need to be unnecessary clutter. And then finally, we have some proposed future work about how to like share data in a type safe way between a story and a test. And then some questions about the feedback that we're looking for. So I'm going to share this in the chat. And then speaking of feedback, so there are 3 ways that I want to show you to share your feedback if you're interested in .test. The first is that RFC, which I just linked you to. The second is if you are in our Discord, we have a channel, SB Test Syntax Early Access, where like people like Kasper or Jan, if you know him as a Storybook maintainer, or me, we're just in here regularly chatting with folks about how we can improve this thing and make it as useful as possible. So I'm going to copy the link to that as well. And then finally, we're going to try, I've never done this before, but I'm going to try to do a poll right here in the webinar. So I'm hoping that popped up for you all. And it's just 3 questions, super quick. But this will help us gauge whether we're on the right track, I think. All right, let me go back to Storybook. And then I'm going to look through the chat to make sure that I got all of your questions. You can also use the Q&A widget to ask a question, and that'll really help me make sure that we see them. All right, I see one. Can meta factories be chained? Like doing like dot extends, but on meta. So that example doesn't quite make sense because you have to extend a full story. You can't just extend meta. But we are possibly looking at putting .test on meta so that you don't need to define a story first. You can just go straight to defining a test. And then those would not be nested under a story. They would just be in the component.
Maybe one other thing that's good to know is that there is an ID. We're not sure yet if we're gonna do it, but you can maybe might be good to get feedback about that. Is to be able to extend previews to basically have multiple preview files. Maybe you have one preview that is for your bigger components, like your page components, and you have one preview for your normal components, so that you can set some different defaults for both. But that's not yet implemented.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that'll be really cool because we found in practice there's often 2 types of stories in a storybook, especially for storybooks for applications. So you usually have your more like atomic components like button or drop-down menu or something, and then you can have full pages that have like data fetching that you have to mock and stuff like that. And those can have a lot of different needs. And so this would allow you to have like 2 kind of global configurations, one for the simple ones and one for the pages, and not have to duplicate all that configuration across your stories. I'm excited for that idea. There's a question. Can you give us a guess about when CSF support for web components might be available? It's a great question. So CSF Next is available now for React in preview. Storybook 10 is coming in just a couple weeks. You might notice that's a little bit sooner than a year from Storybook 9, and we did that on purpose. It's because Storybook 10 only has one major breaking change, and Storybook is now ESM only. So it just does ES modules. It does not distribute common JS code. So that's the only breaking change, significant breaking change in the release. And so we just wanted to get that out as soon as possible. And so that's why it's coming out in the fall instead of the spring, like most of our Storybook releases. So Storybook 11, which will be coming in the spring, like our normal cadence, that's when CSF Next will kind of become the default for Storybook and will be available across all of the renderers. So not just web components, but Angular, Vue, Svelte, Preact, all of them.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, that's a good question. Kyle, do you know if we already have a way to do some default things for every test, like disabling all chromatic snapshots for every test? I thought there we worked on it, but I'm not sure if that's finished.
Um,
Maybe I can ask Jan.
yeah, I don't think we've built that. I think we're waiting on feedback on whether or not it's necessary. So you asking for it is great feedback, and we'll take that back to the team. But we have not built that API yet.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, Here's a question. Seems like grouping in the sidebar is more important than the .test method. Are we expected to get that before CSF Next? So you can do grouping today, just by applying um, title. Here, let's see if our stories file does this. Yeah. So the grouping is by putting this slash separator. So this creates a components directory and a form directory, and then finally the input component. And so you can see how that looks here, where components is the top level directory, a form directory, and then the input component inside of that. You cannot group stories inside of a component. It has to be kind of outside of the component. But that's what's available today. It's possible that the API that we come up with for .test and like how the sidebar hierarchy is affected, it's possible that that might um, also provide a solution for better story grouping. We'll definitely keep that in mind.
There's a question about multiple metas, if that's possible, and that's indeed at this moment not possible. But what you could do is create a story which has all kind of defaults, and then keep extending on that story if you want to reuse that config for other stories.
Okay, great. Ah, that's a great question, and I apologize that I didn't make this more clear. The .test method is like based on and relies on using CSF factories. So in the RFC to use for the .test method, if we go up on the like how to get started, the first step is to run the auto migration to use CSF factories. Um, so you have to be using CSF factories in the same stories file as you write your .test methods. So yeah, it's built upon it. All right. We appreciate all the enthusiasm. We're really excited that you seem to be pretty happy with the API that we have in mind. We've been using it internally, and it does seem to be working quite well. Actually, what I'm going to
Yeah, I
do while
think
we're doing questions here.
the main thing with CSF Next or CSF Factories is that it is like first class TypeScript support. First, it was kind of like you could get type safety, but you have to do all kind of things around it, and you might maybe even make mistakes there. And now it's just like kind of built in. It's even so built in that you kind of have TypeScript support in VS Code. If you use JavaScript, you still get the auto completion of TypeScript at the moment. So that's pretty awesome.
Oops. All right. While we've been doing these questions, I went ahead and installed Playwright because I'd love for you all to see how the component testing works. So here I'll do for input. So I'm gonna run the component tests.
A lot of web components.
Yeah, I'm noticing
Questions.
that too.
Actually, web components is one of the easier ones to get working. Vue and Svelte are harder, so we might need to prioritize web
Okay,
components
so
first.
here you can see like all of my stories were tested and passed, and then all of these tests were also tested and passed. If I were to have a failure, let me just fake a failure real quick. Um, and then I'll retest these. So that's what a failure looks like. And then that also gives like failures down here, and you can toggle that. Oh, you notice that, Kasper?
Hmm.
Apologize. That's a bug we just discovered. This is on the 10 beta, so we're actively QAing it in preparation for full release.
That's weird.
Yeah, so that should have filtered the sidebar down to only show that test and then everything above it, because this is the only thing that's actually failing.
Yeah.
I guess just to show you this, so you can turn on watch mode here, and that will rerun any necessary tests. So I'm going to change this, I'll save it, and then by the time I get back to it, it will probably have reran. Yep. So
Cool.
this is all accomplished through the vtest add-on. This is a pretty cool piece of tech, in my opinion. What it does is it takes your stories and uses a Vite plugin to transform them into vtest tests, so that when they run as tests, you're not spinning up Storybook or running Storybook at all. It's just a vtest test at that point, and that's what allows it to be so fast.
Yeah.
Um, and then it's really easy to run it in CI because you just literally run your vtest command in CLI or CI, and it tests your stories for you. Yeah, that news about Lit joining the OpenJS Foundation is really exciting. I was so happy to see that. There's a question on whether the API will include like a .describe or a .each in addition to .test, which so .describe is kind of a way to like group tests in more traditional testing tools like vtest or jest. And then .each is a way to kind of parameterize a test, so you can test the same thing with like 8 different inputs. Like it would be an alternative way actually to do um, what I did here, where I wrote this check validation function that just kind of accepted this string, and then I changed the string each time. So .each, I would just supply an array of these strings, and then it would run through each item in the array and test each one in the same way. We are looking into all of that. It's not a one-to-one match with how Storybook works and is organized because of our sidebar here, and like we're visual and CLI tools aren't. And so, yeah, it won't be a one-to-one, but we recognize that there are real problems that Describe and each are solving. And so we do want to bring that
Yeah.
um, to Storybook in some way.
Yeah, maybe about describe. You could also see, in some sense, the story a little bit as your describe block. That's kind of the grouping where a lot of tests are under. So, like if you, for example, a use case is often that you use a describe and then you have a before each in this describe block for all those test cases. So in Storybook at this moment, what you could do is attach this before each to your story, because stories also have a before each hook, and then you can there do some kind of stuff you want to do before every test, for example. That is a pattern that you could use today, but I'm still looking into that.
Yeah. All right. Are there any Any final questions? These have been great so far. We're happy to answer as many as you come up with.
Yeah. Right. Hmm. Yeah, web components. One problem that we have with supporting web components is that every kind of framework, like there's the lit framework, of course, but there's also other frameworks have their own templates, syntax. So that makes it harder to support all those different ones. But if you have ideas how we can improve our web component support, we would love to hear that. And
I mean, I know we've had internal discussions about pulling much of the WC toolkit utilities that he mentioned there, just pulling those into the web components framework.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah, other problem that we sometimes have is the querying of the DOM is it's really hard. There's some helpers.
right. Yeah. We did add documentation for that recently. Let me reshare my screen. Um,
By the way, we are all on the Discord. So if you you can tag either me or Kyle or Jan or whatever.
yeah,
And if you want to start a discussion how we can do better here, that I would love to hear that.
yep. So one of the biggest shortcomings with Storybook and web components is that in the play function, we use testing library to do like the querying of elements or the user event library to do the simulated behavior. And none of that works with Shadow DOM. And so we have kind of a recipe here. Share it here. We have a recipe there that shows how to use the Shadow DOM testing library and kind of apply it in a way that just automatically works. So that now in your query, instead of like canvas.find by role, a button with the name reset, it's find by shadow role. And then that will find it even if it's within a shadow root. And this recipe will make sure like all the types work and everything like that. We've used it in multiple projects. It's pretty sound. Nicholas, your question about not exposing dot component, we have a discussion going on right now about the best way to address that. I don't have an answer for you yet, but we are discussing it.
Okay, about the dot component bug that I see in the thread, I just pinged the person responsible for solving it. So it's on our radar. Okay. Do we already have poll results, Kyle?
Yeah. Wow, 100% participation. Thank you so much, everyone. We really appreciate
Ah,
that.
that's
We'll take that
great.
back to the team and use it to continue shaping the API and the experience. Probably the best way to give feedback is as comments on that RFC that I linked. Here, I'll just go ahead and do it again for convenience.
Yeah, great.
And we really appreciate you joining us. A question just popped in. Somewhat off topic, but I'll go ahead and answer it. So the question is, why is there no chromatic for React Native mobile version? Is there anything similar that we can use? So doing visual testing on native applications is much, much harder from an infrastructure standpoint and more expensive from an infrastructure standpoint than doing it for just kind of standard web browsers. You have to have a whole different type of server because you actually have to spin up like devices themselves, not just kind of standard like browser on Linux. We're talking about how to best support that. But in the meantime, you can use React Native Web in your Storybook and then put that on Chromatic to visually test your stories. Yeah, we will definitely, anybody that registered for this webinar, we email out a link of the recording as soon as it's made available. So you can rewatch at your leisure, or if you're not watching live, you can watch it then. Thanks for joining us, everybody. This was really fun. It's great to see your excitement, and we're really happy to share with you some of the directions we're thinking of going.
Certainly. Okay. Thank you all.
Have a great day, everyone.
Bye bye.